Hello, this is a PowerPoint designed for IB higher level history students who are studying Africa and the Middle East for their paper 3 option. It's for the Middle East since 1945, the Egypt case study that mentions Nasser, Sadat and Mubarak, and this slideshow will present on Sadat. It's worth noting that past questions tend to come up on Sadat in some kind of change, continuity, compare and contrast, either from Nasser or looking ahead to Mubarak. So if you're looking at Sadat, then you probably need to make sure that you're clear on Nasser and Mubarak as well to make sure that you could answer that question on paper 3. So right from the start, you want to be thinking about how Sadat and the continuity from Nasser's regime when Nasser dies in 1970. There's another useful video on YouTube made by Al Jazeera. It's called I Knew Sadat, and that gives a pretty pro-Sadat background, but it has some good memories and perspectives from members of his family in considering the Sadat legacy. Like Nasser, he came from a modest background, and too, also like Nasser and of course Mubarak to come, he rises to power and influence through military academy and through the army. He meets Nasser in 1949 and also joins the Free Officers, and it's Sadat that makes the radio broadcast in 1952 that announces the Free Officers coup to the Egyptian people. He's a representative of Egypt internationally, and throughout his career, his kind of international prowess and perhaps kind of shrewd thinking will sustain him on a number of occasions, obviously until his assassination in 1981. He's the vice president of Egypt when Nasser dies in 1970, and that's how he gets into power within a week, really. Cleveland describes Sadat as Nasser's poodle. He's seen as a fairly weak guy, and certainly that's the way he's treated as he comes to power in 1970. Habibi points out in her book about the Middle East that Sadat really does turn Egypt around and puts it on a new path economically, politically and socially, and she says in many cases with a total reversal of the Nasserist regime. So you need to be clear for paper 3 what type of country Sadat inherits in 1970. And certainly it's a troubled one. Economically, Egypt is up to its eyeballs in debt. Socially, despite Nasser's promises, perhaps life for many poor rural Egyptians hasn't improved that much. There's underemployment as well as unemployment. Politically, as you know, Egypt is being run as an authoritarian state. In the Cold War, of course, Nasser had tried to sort of play both sides on a number of occasions, and of course from 1955 onwards was heavily involved in the non-aligned movement. In Arab-Israeli affairs, of course, in other Arab countries, Nasser still is today in many ways the hero of Arab nationalism, and his integrity, despite the kind of challenges that the Suez crisis of '56 and the Six-Day War of 1967 produced for Egypt, Nasser really still is in the ascendancy. So there is trouble ahead for Egypt, and you can see that there. The student protests in 1968. As you know, Nasser did offer to resign in 1967, but that war of attrition that carries on between 67 and 1970, all of that is kind of slowly grinding and wearing Egypt down. So Sadat moves quickly to kind of move on from Nasser's legacy. He changes the name of Egypt from the United Arab Republic, which kind of makes sense really because there is no other country in the United Arab Republic apart from Egypt now since Syria left in 1961. The other key thing to do is that Sadat will work quickly to get rid of potential rivals. He's seen very much as a soft touch, and his widow makes this point in the video, I Knew Sadat, that other people, perhaps those who had been powerful around Nasser, thought Sadat was somebody to be pushed around. He makes it very clear that isn't the case, and between 1971 and 1973, he deals with his key rival in the ASU, Ali Sabri, in May 1971, and then between 1971 and 1973 purges the ASU with any kind of potential leftists and also anyone else that might be opposed to Sadat. He introduces a new constitution. There are some changes from Nasser. Islam is now declared the state religion, and women their rights continue to improve. In general, though, there isn't much else going on in terms of constitutional freedom. The constitution centres power still around the president. He is bolstered, of course, by his success in the 1973 war, which we'll come to later. But after 1979, things kind of get a little more sticky for Sadat, and he does begin to trouble a little bit more. Egypt is increasingly isolated from the Arab world and its neighbourly trading partners, and it does begin to move closer to the USA as a result. So there's some big kind of challenges there for Sadat in kind of political control after Camp David. That's, of course, in 1979. Of course, he'll be dead within a couple of years, but that is also going to cause him problems. In the social context, really, Egypt continues to struggle in terms of social unrest. The serious trouble with loans and foreign money. The IMF tells Egypt to stop subsidising its staple foods. Bread riots really since 1977, and a number of historians argue that that would be a motive for Sadat in kind of making peace with Israel, that it's simply unsustainable for Egypt, the money that's being spent. So those bread riots will be another trigger to the sort of peace moves towards Israel in the later 1970s. The subsidies are restored, though, after trouble. It really can't be managed by the Egyptian government very effectively. In terms of the lives of women under Sadat, a number of things sort of shift and change. There's certainly a return to more traditional values, but women still have equal rights in politics and improving access towards education. The Tala Society, founded by Sadat's wife, is a cooperative which spreads across the country for village women to learn skills, and it basically contributes to the financial welfare of many poor rural families. But there is also a growing tide of Islamism, and perhaps particularly again in rural areas, and women in lower socioeconomic groups kind of heed the call for women to sort of dress more conservatively and follow some more Islamist ideals there. In terms of economic policies, Egypt is in serious trouble with the Nasser inheritance, that no war, no peace, that war of attrition, high military budgets, spending on weapons, all of that costs money. It also means that Egypt loses out on tourism, and of course the continued trouble with the Suez Canal means that Egypt is losing out on earning money. Sadat really does aim to liberalise the economy and replaces an inefficient public sector with a more competitive private sector, thereby increasing investment incentives. I wouldn't say it's a massive success, but things do perhaps begin to improve in terms of incomes and efficiency within the Egyptian economy. In terms of Nasser's welfare reforms, which were expensive, Sadat would not dare undo them. But with the increased confidence of his 1973 victory, the opening, or al-Intifah, does kind of improve and continue a journey away from Nasser. The big hit for Sadat, of course, is the reopening of the Suez Canal in 1975, that symbol of Egypt in so many ways, and of course those all-important revenues from tolls. After 1977, the US is moving towards Egypt more closely with that sort of IMF crisis and those bread riots that I mentioned earlier. Egypt is up to its eyeballs in debt, with an $11 billion debt just to the Soviet Union. They do try really hard to try and sort things out. Oil prices are increasing in the 1970s, so desert oil fields are coming, but inflation is really kind of out of control, and there are some challenges over really the success of the Aswan Dam. It had cost a lot of money. Many of you might remember from your studies on Nasser, perhaps it doesn't deliver everything that it promised, and a number of the sort of land reclamation projects and stuff had failed. So on the whole, though, electric power had quadrupled, flooding had been curtailed, and there was some saving of crops and control of flooding. So mixed response for the Aswan Dam. In terms of the kind of wealthy elites, though, they stay rich, and the rural aristocracy in the south of Egypt stays wealthy. And he kind of continues to foster those people. And remember, many of the army leaders and the army itself was a major landowner, and Sadat will always stay on the good side of them. Many Egyptian professionals and skilled labourers are working overseas, sending money home, and about 30% of those overseas workers were women. In terms of the Cold War, Sadat tries again, really like Nasser did, to play both sides, so he will end up in the camp of the US by the end of it. In 1971, he signs an Egyptian-Soviet friendship treaty. He then abrogates it and then restarts it again. Really, they're struggling to pay off that massive debt to the Soviet Union. But by the mid-late 1970s, the USA is seeing a Cold War opportunity and helping Egypt out with some of its aid requests. The 1973 war is the key point for Sadat's foreign policy. Of course, he negotiates with and works with the Syrians to get that war started, but as you might be aware, once that war goes on, there really is little communication to them, and the Syrians are certainly disappointed with the sort of lack of follow-up after the crossing of the Suez Canal. So that's becomes a sticking point there for them. But Sadat's reputation is utterly secured at this point. He becomes the hero of the crossing. And even though the war is not a victory for Egypt, certainly Egypt has fought better than in previous wars. So perhaps a rise in profile of it. But of course, what the 1973 war also shows is that a kind of a determined, resolute victory against Israel is becoming increasingly, it seems increasingly impossible. And with that, money problems, pressure from the USA, those bread riots, Sadat becomes to realize that perhaps the move forward now is to make some kind of settlement and come to some kind of arrangement with Israel. In 1977, he travels to Israel and addresses the Knesset. And then with the Camp David negotiations that begin in September 1978 and end in the Peace Treaty of 79, he kind of gets his kind of big foreign aid coup in terms that the US will continue to support. But in the meantime, he loses the support of his neighbors as Egypt is thrown out of the Arab League and the Islamic Conference organization. So a really mixed report for Sadat, and certainly you can argue that there are huge successes and failures for him, certainly in terms of foreign policy. He does lead the way for peace with Israel and that accommodation of Israel. The economy is liberalized. Some people are better off, but he does maintain the power of the wealthy landowning elites. And he's as secure in his power as an authoritarian leader when he dies. He's assassinated in October 1981 at an anniversary parade for the celebration of the 1973 war. He has now isolated Egypt. They are on their own after that signing of the peace with Israel. One of the other challenges that you might not be aware of is he kind of had quite a flashy lifestyle and a fairly Western image. And I think that kind of glitz perhaps contrasted not so attractively with the kind of down-home NASA kind of austere qualities that NASA had. He had looked after his wealthy elites and he had really centered and maintained the power around himself. To finish off, there's a kind of supposition here that you might want to have a look at. Habibi has this in the book that she co-authored, the Middle East history book that you might be familiar with. And here's a good kind of change continuity question about Sadat. If you've got access to Cleveland, the page references are there. And also have a look at the kind of big foreign policy implications for Anwar Sadat. So hopefully this was useful. Thanks for listening. Bye.